Well, let's come on to the serious subject of war dead in the war in Ukraine. The BBC is really becoming, well, not quite sure what to say, but we know that they've been operating as the spokespeople for Zelensky for some time. And here is the bizarre claim: Ukraine war, Zelensky aid reveals up to 13,000 war dead. Now, let's have a look at the comment in the article itself. It says up to 13,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed since the start of Russia's invasion, a senior official said. I read that figure. I was just incredulous that the BBC would bother to print it. He said that, so the Ukrainian side said between 10,000 and 13,000 troops had died. It went on to say that this particular gentleman had said in June that between 100 and 200 Ukrainian soldiers were dying annually. Dying daily, apologies. And that was then contrasted with the US General Mark Milley saying that around 100,000 Russian and 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers had been killed or wounded since the start of the war. So this is a huge spread of figures here, and we're to believe that none of the NATO systems, the UK or the US intelligence systems, are capable of working out what the casualties are. Well, the BBC strapped across this the question: can we say how many people have died in Ukraine? And if you have a look at the BBC reports, they specialise in a whole lot of infographics, where here we're to believe back in July that the casualties were a relatively small number, tragic nonetheless, but still small. But this is how the BBC is selling the propaganda to the public. So you can see this little graphic clocking up to over 10,000, 10,470. Then we've got other graphics mainly focusing on Russian military deaths. So this is going to the 27th of June this year, 35,450 for Ukrainian deaths. Sorry, that has come from the Russians. Here we've got 10,000 deaths reported in Ukraine from another source. So the point we're trying to make here is that it just appears the BBC has no idea what's happening. But if we come back to the admitted losses, which have been reported widely, of 100, 200, 300 men killed in action per day. The war's now in its 283rd day, so 100 per day is 28,300 losses on the Ukrainian side. At 300 per day, we're into 84,900. But we've now got Russian troops coming in, over 300,000 troops with massive amounts of artillery. And there's already been reports of Ukrainian killed in Bakhmut around 500 per day. But we've also got this claim of 100,000 Ukrainian military dead. And this insert from the BBC article is also picking up on the fact that a few days ago, the head of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said that 100,000 Ukrainian troops had been killed. Let's just have a look at this little bit of video clip to hear what she did say, because this has now been removed.
More than 100,000 Ukrainian military officers have been killed so far.
Well, she uses the term officers, but everybody agreed she was talking about military casualties. But surprisingly, she was confused. She made a mistake. She didn't know the correct figures. And so that has been pulled, and the BBC is very quick to point that out. So the reality is this, that the Ukrainian killed in action is so high that certainly Zelensky daren't report them because of the damage it would do inside Ukraine. And of course, the BBC dare not report them because that would enable people in UK and the West to understand the true state of the war. But if we go in a different direction, the fact is that most battlefield deaths and injuries are caused by shelling. Ukraine has admitted that Russia fires up to 6 to 9 shells for every Ukrainian shell. So if we take Russian killed at 40,000, we make it lower than the claim by the USA, then Ukrainian losses could be as high as 240,000 killed. So the BBC simply doesn't know what the facts are, but we know that the casualties at the moment for the Ukrainians are horrific. And these are some of the reports that have emerged over the last few days. Bakhmut is littered with Russian corpses, apparently. No mention of the Ukrainian deaths, so this seems to be a very one-sided war. Ukraine live inside Bakhmut front line, littered with corpses and colossal losses. And this is more to the reality of the situation. But surprisingly, it's coupled with the fact that the Western media is still on the lines of, is Russia running out of ammunition? How much longer can it keep fighting? And apparently Wednesday, the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was telling journalists that Russia has struggled with logistics and they're very short of ammunition. But the reality is, of course, that the Russian attacks are increasing. So I'm just going to call this dross reporting. And we're going to contrast it by the fact that we've now got Western media quite rightly pointing out that the British Army in particular would be out of ammunition in a week if it was fighting in the Ukraine conflict due to the intensity. And this is just, well, what could we call it? Cognitive dissonance by mainstream media. The reality is that Britain, US and NATO are out of ammunition. This is why they can't supply it to Ukraine in the quantity necessary. Meanwhile, Russia, we see no sign of the ammunition or missile shortages, no sign of it running out. So let's contrast that with a little video clip of the Finnish Prime Minister talking with wide-eyed surprise about what was actually taking place in Ukraine.
To buy energy from Russia, to close in those economic ties. And we thought that this would prevent the war, that we would have such a close ties to Russia that it would be totally madness to go to war with any European countries. But this was proven entirely wrong.
Well, there we are, David. I could see your face as that little clip came up. A young woman just totally bemused and surprised that she couldn't work out what had happened, even though Putin clearly told the West what was going to happen if they continue to press NATO, and in particular nuclear weapons, up to the Russian borders.
He did. And NATO were on the record that the Ukrainian ascension to NATO was assured. It was a certainty. It was just a matter of timing. This is the statement that was made, and this was made and not rescinded, despite the dispute over the Crimea, which made clearly any NATO expansion into Ukraine a powder keg. And a fast sprint to war. And it was known in the West that we were pushing the Russians to a point where they saw their vital interests at stake and would react. And when that reaction came, Ukraine was going to have the country wrecked, and that's exactly what's happened. She didn't see it coming, but there were many wiser voices in the West that did. Unfortunately, Western governments, Western leaders were not listening to any of these wiser voices.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just wanted to contrast that very naive Finnish Prime Minister with somebody I'm going to call a real lady. We've shown this clip before, but let's think about the contrast.
I voted against this report. Its timing is pretty appropriate, coming as it does a few short weeks after the 11th anniversary of the day Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi was killed during the NATO assault on Libya, sodomised with a bayonet and shot in the head. The NATO intervention in Libya, carried out in the name of protecting freedom, democracy and human rights, is one we do well to remember as NATO plays out its proxy war in Ukraine in the name of, you've guessed it, freedom, democracy and human rights. Because what happens after NATO intervenes in your country on this basis? Terror, death, lawlessness, rape, poverty, starvation. Libya is a country riven by conflict, its economy shattered, its population, formerly the wealthiest in Africa, ridden and mired in poverty. Migrants are bought and sold in slave markets. 1 million people rely on humanitarian aid. It's a country of mass graves, of crimes against humanity. This is NATO's legacy. This is NATO's rights strategy and democracy.
So there we are, and we'll just end on this incredible article that the Express decided to publish. Ukraine to trigger military collapse in Russia with morale shattering spring offensive. How anybody could believe this, I simply do not know. It's either fantasy or drugs or both, but the press seem prepared to print it. We just remind ourselves that the death at the moment unfolding in Ukraine is not the responsibility of an organisation. It's due to decisions that people have made, and we need to be focusing on those people and getting them to stop the fight.